Welcome back to Apostles Mailbox, where today we resume our study in the book of John as we look at the one who walks on water. As we walk our way through this text, we're going to have a little bit of information on semantic range and the danger of going beyond what is written as we read between the lines. So stick around. It should be a good one. Okay. I will freely acknowledge that I say that a lot, that it's going to be a good one. Always, when I film an episode, a lot of preparation and study and thinking has gone into it. And so after all of that hard work of preparation, of course, I will be excited about what we're talking about. Today's passage is a little bit interesting in that it's a fairly short passage, and there's not a ton that is very overtly stated there. And so it forces us to do a little bit of asking the questions of how do we read between the lines here? And so there's some interesting parallels that we'll maybe make with the Old Testament as we continue our study in the book of John. But also there's a warning, I think, for us not to casually go beyond what is written. All right, so let's begin with the text. You'll see what I mean. We're back where we left off in John chapter 6. We've only got a handful of verses to cover today, verses 15 through 21, and the action itself is fairly straightforward. So in verse 15, and we talked about this one last week, Jesus had just fed the 5,000. And in verse 15, we read that perceiving then that they, that is these 5,000 men plus women and children, were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Now, when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. All right, so let's talk about this a minute. So at the last stop in the book of John that we made, Jesus he had miraculously fed 5,000 men plus women and children out of 5 loaves and 2 fish, right? And so the crowd is very excited about him, that the hand of God is with him, and they want him to overthrow the Romans and to be their savior, their political Messiah, the one who will deliver them from the oppression of their enemies. Jesus does not want that to happen, and so he goes away by himself, and his disciples then go down into the boat. They get in the boat on the Sea of Galilee, and they row 3 or 4 miles away. Now, there are not a whole lot of specifics given to us. If we look at the accounts of this walking on water here in some of the other Gospels, we get slightly different details and slightly more details, a little bit more explanation. But for whatever reason, John doesn't want us to fixate on those. We're just told that they started across the sea. It's dark, and Jesus was not with them. Okay, so when this storm comes up, they're alone. Jesus is not with them. And they're 3 to 4 miles across the Sea of Galilee, and this storm comes up, and they are frightened, perhaps. Okay, it was rough, we're told, but we aren't exactly told that they're all freaking out, just that it was rough. Now, when they see Jesus, we're told here in verse 19, when they see Jesus walking on the sea, then they were frightened. Okay, so the fear seems to come in this passage from seeing Jesus walking on the sea. And he says to them, "Look, it's me. Don't be afraid." And they were glad to take him into the boat. Now, when we read this passage, if you read commentaries on this, what happens is there's not a whole lot that is obvious and clearly taught from this. Okay, you have an account of something that happens, but we're not told what it means or what we're supposed to gather from it or what we're supposed to conclude, if anything. And so what that does is it leaves this work of interpreting the meaning and the application of this that leaves that up to us. And if you're a Bible teacher, then sometimes it's hard just to read a passage and say, oh, so that happened. That was good. There's a pressure, of course, to say something profound and interesting. And also there's a curiosity, I think, that grows up in many of us when we read something like this that just says, well, what was that all about? Is there something going on here that I'm oblivious to? And as regards this passage, as I was reading commentaries and other people's opinions on this, there were a few passages that were remarked upon as possible connections to this that the author of this gospel is trying to make. So I wanted to look through those a little bit, and then we'll comment on them. So the first possible background is from Psalm 77. We have this psalm that it says, when the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. The clouds poured out water, the skies gave forth thunder, your arrows flashed on every side. So you have the storm being said, and then a little bit later on it says, your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. Now, if you're thinking, okay, here we have a bunch of people in a boat, there's a storm, we've got water, we've got a storm, and then we have somebody walking on the water whose footsteps, of course, won't be seen, and his way is through the sea. And maybe if you're a good Jew, then you think of Psalm 77 and you go, oh, that must be what the author of the gospel is trying to say. And a number of commentators said this is the background for this passage. But let's look at this a little bit more closely here. So the first thing I notice with this is that in the psalm it says, when the waters saw you, the waters were afraid and the deep trembled. Okay, this is an anthropomorphism where you apply human characteristics to a inanimate object, to a not human object. Okay, and so when the waters tremble, that is a way of saying the waters were stirred up, they were agitated. It doesn't mean the waters were actually afraid, and yet it paints a pretty nice picture in this psalm that the waters were afraid. But note, though, that it's the waters that saw God and were afraid. And in the book of John, if we look here, what happens is when the disciples see Jesus, they were frightened. The people were frightened, not the waters. Okay, so the waters were agitated and stirred up because of the storm, and they weren't stirred up because they saw Jesus. So there's already a little bit of a difference here. Let's see if there's any more. Furthermore, the psalm says that that God's way was through the sea. His path was through the great waters. And of course, we know in John, Jesus is not walking through the waters, he's walking on top of the waters. So there's another slight difference. But then, what do we get to? We get, you led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. And so one of the points of this is, look, here we have a picture of the Israelites coming out of Exodus and the waters being pushed aside and God bringing his people through them by the hand of Moses. So, if there is a connection linguistically between John and Psalm 77, there's this word in the Greek that is used that says that they were afraid, that is also used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, but it's sort of a weak link. But I think if there is a link here, the link is this. Remember, we've been talking in John how Jesus is the greater Moses. All right, how Moses promised, God had promised through Moses that he would send a prophet like unto Moses who would speak all God's words. And so if there's an intended connection between fear and waters and going through the waters, then the connection that is intended might be that Jesus is the fulfillment of this promise for a greater Moses. But at any rate, I don't think it's a very strong link. And I think if you say, well, we have to understand this part of John in terms of Psalm 77, there's just not enough there to go on. Okay, I think it's a bit of a stretch. So is there something else? Well, in Job chapter 9, we have this amazing statement that is talking about God that says, He alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. It's Job chapter 9, verse 8. And you think, wow, this is really cool. It says that God alone walks on the waters. Clearly, this must be a reference to that when Jesus walks on the waters, it proves that Jesus is God because only God can walk on the waters. Isn't that wonderful? This is really cool. But again, is that text going to hold? Because as we continue to read in Job chapter 9, verse 8, we talk about God treading on the waves of the sea. It says, He's the maker of the Bear and Orion, the Pleiades and the constellations of the south. He performs wonders that cannot be fathomed, miracles that cannot be counted. When He passes me, I cannot see Him. When He goes by, I cannot perceive Him. Okay, so if you read a little bit in Job, you find out that the one in Job who walks on the waters cannot be seen when He goes by us. And what happens in John here? Well, Jesus is walking on the sea and they see Him and they're afraid. In Mark, when the same event is being recounted, it says in verse 48 that Jesus meant to pass by them, that He was going to just walk by the disciples, but they saw Him and they freaked out and they were terrified. So He says, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. Okay, so if we're going to connect it to Job, then we're going to find a bit of a disconnect here between the one who treads on the waters and cannot be seen versus the one who treads on the waters, but even when he is intending to walk by his disciples, is seen by them. Okay, so there might be a connection. I think there's maybe a little bit, quite simply because treading on the waves or walking on the water is it's a fairly odd concept, right? It's not something that shows up a lot here and there. Okay, a storm, that happens a lot. Fear, that shows up a lot in the scriptures, but walking on the water, not so much. Okay, so possibly Job 9 is some of the background to what is going on here in John chapter 6. How about this? Here's another one that came up in one or two places, though frankly, not by many. And it is this statement in verse 20. Jesus said to them, "It is I." And why would this be remarkable to us, according to commentators? Well, usually the argument goes like this. God used the phrase, I am, as his name, and Jesus, when he says, I am, that means Jesus is claiming to be God. And so let's see if that's true. Here's the background that is typically cited for that, which is in Isaiah 46, verse 3 and 4. God is speaking. He says, "Listen to me, O house of Jacob, all the remnant of the house of Israel, who have been born by me from before your birth, carried from the womb, even to your old age, I am he. And to gray hairs I will carry you. I have made and I will bear, I will carry and will save." And in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, which is the Septuagint, and its abbreviation is LXX, which represents 70, which stands for the Septuagint, we have this phrase, ego eimi, which means I am he. And it simply is stated, I am he. The word ego is I, and eimi is the verb to be, I am. Okay, so the question then is, when Jesus says, I am, ego eimi, is he claiming to be God? Or is he not? And often people will point to Isaiah 46 and they will say, this is Jesus claiming to be God. But there's a problem with that, okay? And I want to explain it to you. And actually, I'm not the only one who says this. The majority of the commentaries that I read, written by Trinitarian scholars who believe that Jesus is God, nevertheless are quick to say Jesus is not claiming to be God in this passage. He simply is not. What he's saying is, hey, it's me. And here's why. In John 9:9, which we haven't got to yet, but we'll get there was a man who was born blind, and he was healed. And people are trying to figure out if this man that they're talking about, who's present, is the man who was born blind and healed. And some kept saying, yes, it's him. And others said, no, he's like him. And he kept saying, I am the man. That's how the English Standard Version translate it. But in the Greek, literally, it just says, ego eimi, I am. Ego eimi, I am. The same two words that Jesus uses in John chapter 6. And clearly in John 9, we know this man born blind is not claiming to be God. He's not saying a statement that he or anybody else would have understood to be a claim to be God. He's just saying, look, it's me. It's me. I am. It's me. I think we might have talked about this before, okay? So Jesus, while his disciples are freaking out, like, who's walking on the water? It must be a ghost. It must be some disembodied spirit coming after us. Jesus says, hey, it's me. Don't worry. Okay, so that's what he's saying. And practically every commentator I read affirms this. However, there were a few who are like, no, this proves that Jesus is God because he uses the phrase, I am. And I am is the name of God, as we saw supposedly in Isaiah 46. But if we go to the place where God actually tells Israel what his name is, when Moses goes and speaks to God in Exodus 3:14, we have in the Septuagint, we have that God says to Moses this phrase, I am who I am, and he said, say this to the people of Israel, the I am has sent me to you. Okay? So we have two phrases here. Ego eimi is the I am, and ho'on is the phrase that means the one who is, or the being one. So in this verse, when God says to Moses first, I am who I am, that is the English translation of this phrase in the Greek, or in the Hebrew, ego eimi ho'on. Jesus says, ego, I, eimi, am, ho'on, the being one, or the living one, or the one who is. Okay? So then when he says, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you, what phrase is being translated there? Is ego eimi being translated, or is ho'on being translated? And as we would have it, the word being translated, the I am has sent me to you, is ho'on. Okay? So in Exodus 3:14, when God tells Israel, here's my name, and that's translated from Hebrew into Greek, the translation in Exodus 3 is God says, you should go say to the people of Israel, ho'on, the being one, has sent me to you. That is the name, ho'on, not ego eimi. Ego eimi is a phrase that literally just means I am something. Okay? And so when we look at this passage here, and Jesus says, ego eimi, he is not claiming the name that God told Moses to use to refer to himself before Israel. All right? And this is why most commentators will agree and say, look, I know people have used this to claim that Jesus is stating that he is Yahweh, but it is not actually the case. He is simply identifying himself to a group of people who are afraid and terrified because they see somebody walking on the water, and that is not natural. And so they assume it's some oppressive spirit or something. And he says, don't worry, guys, it's me. All right? And so the danger, of course, and the reason that I bring this all up is because very often what happens when we have a text that is not readily apparent to us what it means, we might go searching for something that it means, and we might find a link that seems to tie the two together, and we might draw some conclusions that are unhelpful or very wrong, but because we've proved it from some verses in the Bible, we're sure that we're right. And there's a danger here, and I want to warn you against that, and I'm going to do it by using another example from the book of Isaiah and also from the book of Ezra. So what if we're trying to figure out, like, okay, so who is Jesus? Well, we've established in the New Testament that Jesus is the servant of God and that he is the Messiah. The Greek word is Christ, and that he is king over all nations, right? So we find these things in the New Testament, and then we go back to our Old Testament. We're going to say, is there any being in the Old Testament who is king over all things, and who is the Messiah, the Christ, and who is the servant of God? And after a little bit of searching, we might come to these passages. Okay, so in Ezra 1, thus says Cyrus, the king of Persia, he says, Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. Okay, so here we have a guy who's king over all kings. And then Isaiah 44 tells us that God, that Yahweh says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall fulfill all my purpose. And then in Isaiah 45, verse 1, we have, thus says Yahweh to his anointed, and the Greek word literally is Christ, Christos. Yahweh says to Christos, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him and to loose the belts of kings, to open doors before him, that gates may not be closed. Okay, so if you look at these, you find three very clear and direct things that are said of Cyrus, that are also said of Jesus. And if you were doing poor exegesis, you could try to argue that Jesus is actually Cyrus, died and reincarnated, or that Jesus was first incarnated as Cyrus and later reincarnated as Jesus of Nazareth. And those conclusions should sound to you absolutely absurd, because that is not the point of what's going on. Okay, God has many servants. God has many people that he anointed for different purposes over his life, right? And God has established and thrown down many kings. Okay. And so what we have here with Cyrus is not proof that Jesus is Cyrus, but what we have is a type or a pattern, a prefiguring of something that was true of Cyrus that will be true in a different way of Jesus, in a bigger way. Okay? And the way language works is precisely this. The context of every statement helps define the words. Okay? And so the context of a certain word in a certain setting will mean one thing, and then in a different setting, that same word will mean something else. Let's imagine the word light. Okay? If I say I turned on the light, you will know that I flipped a switch to make a physical device emit light. Okay? But if I say, boy, I was blinded by the light, then you would know that I went into a place where the light, the photons were actually so intense that they blinded me, that I couldn't see for a minute. Okay? And similarly, that word blinded, you would know that it didn't mean that I was permanently blinded, that I could never see again, but that for the moment I couldn't see. And so there's a nuance by that context. Now, if I say, oh boy, that meal was nice and light, you would not think of light bulbs or photons. You would think of a dinner that sat well in my stomach, that wasn't really greasy and heavy and spicy, but it was nice and light. Or if I said, I went to pick up the weight and it was surprisingly light, you would know it didn't mean any of those other three things. It wasn't a meal that was light, it wasn't a light bulb, it wasn't a photon. Okay, so that word light would have to do with having a small weight. Okay, now all of those words have their own unique use, or the same word I should say has a different use in different things, and this is something that generally we can refer to as a semantic range. A semantic range is the breadth of all the different possible ways in which a word can be used. And it is wrong of us to assume that when we use a word that we mean all of those meanings, or that we mean precisely one of those meanings simply because that's what the word means. Okay, so when we use language, we are always figuring out the meaning of the word, not just from the word itself, but from the way it is used and from the ideas that come to mind when we use it. And these are things we do intuitively without thinking too much. And this is what makes it hard for us to translate Scripture, is because when we hear words, which were not actually the words used in Greek or Hebrew when the Bible was written, we hear an English word and we bring with it all of these English ideas, modern ideas with it, and we assume that's what the word means. But that particular word, when used in the Greek, might have had a different range of possible meanings, or in Hebrew might have had an even further different range of possible meanings. And it's a trap for us to think, well, just because a certain word means something today in one particular use means that's what that same word or the equivalent word in a different language meant in a different context. Okay, so we can see it with Cyrus here. It's kind of belaboring the point here. But Cyrus is king over all the earth, which literally isn't all of the kingdoms of the earth. It's a unique use of the language there. He is God's shepherd and he is God's Christ. He is his anointed in that place. That doesn't mean that Cyrus is Jesus and Jesus is Cyrus. That's not how language works. So when we come then to Jesus walking on the water, and we see some things happening. We have Jesus walking on the water, and this is a really incredibly powerful picture of something. And in our minds, we think, well, what does that something mean? Our temptation is to ignore the nuance of language and picture and symbolism, and to try to make direct equal signs. And I think very often we get into a trap when we do this. Somebody once upon a time said, when Jesus says ego eimi, he's claiming to be God because God says ego eimi about himself in Isaiah 46. And you hear it and it sounds impressive and you can't really argue with it because you don't read Greek and you can't go back to Isaiah 46. And maybe you go online and you say, oh my goodness, look at that. It is those exact same words in Isaiah 46. That must mean that whoever says ego eimi is claiming to be God. But that's not how language works. And furthermore, when God uses his name in the context of ego eimi, he says ego eimi ho'on, and the name that God gives to Moses is actually not ego eimi, but it's ho'on. Okay, so there is a lot of bad scholarship, bad assumptions being perpetuated because we take language, which has very diverse and nuanced use, and we try to take the meaning, we try to photocopy the meaning from one context, let's say in Isaiah, and smash it into another context where that's not exactly what is being stated. Okay, and particularly in this case, it's not being stated. So if we look at John 6, then what are some of the things that we should conclude? Okay, well, I tried to come up with some safe conclusions. Number one, that God's power is clearly seen at work in Jesus Christ. Okay, normal human power does not allow you to walk on water. You can't do it. Okay, so clearly we see that there is some divine power at work here. And I would say, if there is some allusion to Job or to the Psalm 77 going on here in this passage, or perhaps in like Jonah. In Jonah, you had people rowing hard in the midst of a storm, and the storm was calmed when action was taken. You might say that this is a good reminder for us that God is still doing miraculous things in terms of storms and waters. And when we are afraid, he is our deliverer. Okay, so you might conclude those things. God's power is clearly seen at work in Jesus, that the life of Jesus demonstrates that God has not changed, that God still delivers as he did in the days of Moses and David and Abraham. And then you have perhaps some possible conclusions. Okay, we might say, well, the point of writing this by John was maybe John wanted us to recognize, to know that if we recognize and welcome Jesus, that we find peace. Right? So you have these disciples, they're freaking out because they see something they don't understand, but that something identifies himself as Jesus, and they welcome him. And when they do, he gets in the boat and they show up where they're going. Maybe that's what John wants us to say. Okay, there's no good way to prove that was the point of it or not, but it seems like it's a possible conclusion. Another one would be to recognize that when our striving is hopeless, Jesus brings completion. So one of the things that you see in this passage is that they had rowed 3 or 4 miles, they're stuck in the middle of the sea, and when Jesus gets in the boat, verse 21, it says, immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. Now, did Jesus do a miracle and teleport them to the land, or is this a way of saying, like, once Jesus got into the boat, the rest of the journey went basically seamlessly, and the word could possibly take on the meaning of very soon or more or less immediately, but not like instantly like we think of it. It's possible that that's the case. We're not taught anything about this miracle, what it means, if it is a miracle or if it's just Jesus bringing them in the midst of the storm to that. And maybe if Psalm 77 is in view, that it's a reference to Moses again, so that we will remember that Jesus is the greater Moses, the one who is promised, that John is developing this idea. Okay? So those are some possible conclusions. But again, here's the deal. Like because we're used to hearing a sermon about a passage, we want a few verses to have a complete idea, to have a clear teaching, and so that we can draw these firm conclusions, and then so we can go out and do it. And with certain types of literature, this works fairly well, and with others, it doesn't work quite so well. And so it's entirely possible that this happens because it is consistent with the character of God, and that he does miraculous things to bring out his the completion of his purposes, and that Jesus, as God's Son and as the Messiah, the deliverer, that God has miraculously empowered him to do these things in front of his disciples, and that they would see him. But we are not taught from this passage. And so what we're left with really is the impact that this narrative has on our understanding and our expectation. Okay, and sometimes I think there's far more to be gained when we read the scriptures rather than trying to say, what does it mean? As if there's one specific didactic, teaching point that it's supposed to make. And instead, if we absorb the attitudes and the expectations and the sense of it all. Okay, so if you only memorize one verse, you will often misinterpret that verse. But if you read the entirety of Scripture again and again and again and again, pretty soon its words and its phrases and its pacing and its pictures start to sink into your head, and they start to shape the way that you see reality. And so it's entirely possible here that John is painting a picture of God's miraculous power at work in Jesus, because that's enough. It happened, and he wants us to remember it. At the end of the book of John, in John chapter 20, we have this statement, okay? John is writing this, and he says, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." And so if we read that, when we get to the end of John, we might look back and say, oh, well, maybe that's the reason that John told us about the walking on the water. It was so that we would believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing, we might have life in his name. Not very profound, but certainly faithful to the witness and the clear teaching of John.